Welcome to Mind Trip FM, your nightly historical haven. If our stories help you relax, fall asleep, or simply soothe your curious mind, please like, subscribe, or leave a comment telling us what kind of stories you'd like to hear. Now, let go of the day, close your eyes, and join us as we journey into a forgotten world. Did you know that at the height of the Renaissance, some physicians thought the flesh of the dead could cure the living? You would not believe how widely it was used, nor how quickly superstition and science braided into something monstrous. Imagine yourself in Florence, in the year 1543. The city smells of oranges and coal smoke. Merchants haggle in the piazza. Above the clamor, in a narrow alley, a small shop hides behind a faded sign, Officina di Medicina. You push the door, and the bell tinkles. Inside, bottles catch the late sun like captured stars. Jars of herbs, skulls, and a ledger sit on a long oak counter. The physician who runs this place is not a witch. He is trained, licensed, and respected. He learned anatomy from dissections. He reads Galen and Paris, but he also believes in the curative power of human tissues, dried and crushed into powders. You are his apprentice. You fetch mortar and pestle. You slice dried roots and weigh powders on a brass scale. Today you will witness a remedy that most modern minds would call barbaric, but in that age is accepted medical practice: the use of human bone, fat, and blood as salves, plasters, and spices. People call it by a polite Latin name, Mumia humana, or sometimes simply mumia. In marketplaces, it is sold as a medicinal spice, and in court, it is recommended for fevers, epilepsy, and melancholy. A wealthy merchant arrives with his child. The child has a fever that will not break. The physician opens a small chest and pulls out a dark jar, labeled in careful hand. Inside lies a brittle substance that looks like resin, but was not made from trees. It has a pungent, iron-like smell. You watch as he chops a sliver, mixes it with wine and cinnamon, and administers the draught. The child drinks. Night passes. By morning, the fever subsides. The father weeps with relief and hands the doctor a purse heavy with coins. He will tell everyone that this physician has a miracle in his drawer. It is tempting to stop here and call it primitive superstition. Yet the story is not so simple. For many physicians, the belief in human-based remedies has a logic. The Renaissance mind is obsessed with correspondence, sympathies between body parts, between humors, and even between lives. A dried skull fragment, carefully powdered, is thought to warm the brain when consumed in small amounts. A little ash from burned bone, placed in an ointment, is believed to staunch bleeding. These are not random spells, but a system of thought that reads the world in analogies. And we must also remember the fear of plague. When entire towns are swept away by fever and gangrene, desperate measures seem rational. When doctors see other remedies fail, when leeches and cupping do not stop the rot mummy, powdered human heart, and even corpse fat become options. The line between healer and charlatan blurs. Reputation, not evidence, confers authority. If a remedy earns a recovery, the remedy gains legitimacy. However, there is another strand to this tale that smells more sinister. Alongside genuine practitioners, merchants and grave robbers enter the business. Fresh corpses are not the only source. Criminals sell the bodies of executed men and women. In some regions, the bodies of condemned thieves are taken and boiled down to produce a supposedly potent powder. There are also reports of merchants in far ports who bring back jars of imported mummy claimed to be exotic remains from distant deserts. Whether real or fabricated, the trade flourishes. You learn the trade, you learn the recipes, you learn to read the ledger full of clients who seek the spice. Then one winter evening, a cloaked figure enters the shop. He speaks in hushed tones and offers a bag wrapped in oilskin. Inside is a portion of what appears to be dried flesh, reddish and oddly fragrant. He says it comes from a nobleman who died in a distant castle. The physician examines it, tests the texture, and nods. He writes a mark in the ledger, and the transaction is done. The cloak leaves, and the city continues to breathe its warm, dangerous air. Over the next weeks, you watch how this substance moves through the city. Apothecaries grind it into powders and sell it in tiny sachets for headaches. Midwives mix minute amounts into salves for postpartum bleeding. A barber surgeon slathers a plaster containing boiled flesh over a leg wound. Stories of miraculous cures spread quickly, then more quickly still. Testimonies become legend. And where a legend takes root, demand grows. But not all demand is honest. Corruption sets in. The highest bidders acquire the best material. Poorer patients get cheap substitutes. Animal bones charred and dyed with iron to mimic the look and smell. Some sellers advertise Oriental Mumia, a label that implies exotic strength and raises the price. You see signs posted in the market, Mumia of Persian kings, ancient Egyptian dust, and worse, Mumia for kings only. Wealth becomes a gateway to the most macabre luxuries. Then the scandals begin. A young noblewoman dies after a concoction of mummy oil is applied in a sensitive area. An outbreak of illness follows a batch of contaminated powder. Fingers point. Accusations of fraud and poisoning fly through the guild halls. Yet the physician you serve defends his practice. He insists his sources are clean, his methods precise, and his intent noble. He cites ancient authorities and recent successes. He will lose some clients, but he keeps his jars, his spells, and his ledger, because the trade is profitable and the belief is stubborn. And then you hear rumors of a more terrifying use. There are whispers that some remedies require a particular kind of human substance. The fat of an infant, the bone of a virgin, or the blood of a murderer. The logic is grotesque. Certain qualities in life were thought to persist in the body after death. An infant is pure, a virgin is untouched, a murderer is potent. These attributes, in the minds of some, could be harnessed for medicine. The very idea turns your stomach, yet whispers turn into orders. Patrons demand such ingredients and will pay handsomely. At night, you lie awake and wonder about the ethics of it all. You think of the graveyards where handshakes between robbers and merchants disturb the silent dead. You think of the poor and the powerless whose bodies supply the jars. You think of the faces of clients who are relieved and those of families who suspect their loved ones are missing. You begin to ask whether the progress of medicine in this era is burdened by a moral price that the living pay with the dead. This is the world you will inhabit for the coming chapters, a world where science, superstition, commerce, and morality twist together. We have only just opened the jar. The trade in mummy powder is bigger than you imagine. It runs like a shadow economy beneath the more respectable lines of trade: silk, spices, dyes, caravans carry jars, labeled in strange scripts, from Alexandria to Venice. Merchants who once trafficked in frankincense and resins now pack chests with brittle black lumps and crude sachets of powdered remains. The merchants keep 2 ledgers, one for customs, one for customers. In public, they sell saffron and myrrh. In private, they sell memory and mortality. You travel with one such trader to the docks at Venice. The lagoon smells of brine and tar. Boats from the Levant unload amphorae and crates. Your guide moves through the market as if it were a church. He speaks in low voices to a small man in a hood who nods and points to an alcove. You follow and watch as sacks are exchanged for coins, as a crate is opened to reveal strips of resinous material that look like petrified flesh. The material is said to come from the tombs of ancient kings' Egyptian mummies, broken down and exported to the Mediterranean world. The story sells because it is exotic and old. Antiquity implies power. If something survived centuries, it surely contains force. Apothecaries will stamp their jars with exotic origins to command higher prices. A label that reads Egyptian mumia brings more coin than one that reads local putrefaction. The deception is part of the salesmanship. And yet, not every jar is a fraud. Some shipments do contain human remains. And archaeologists today will tell you that European markets did, in fact, receive material from embalmed bodies. The mummies of Egypt, long disturbed by tomb robbers and curious foreigners, furnished a ready supply. The mummified tissue is treated with oils, resins, and salts were highly aromatic and took on a resinous texture that made them attractive as a medicinal base. To some practitioners, the idea that a pharaoh's preserved body might hold medical virtue was not absurd. Antiquity equaled authority. Inside guild halls, debates rage. Some apothecaries insist on provenance, demanding letters and ships' manifests. Others accept the simpler logic of results. If the remedy works, who cares where it came from? A few physicians make careers out of skepticism, analyzing packets with crude chemical tests and calling out forgeries. But forgery can be sophisticated. Powdered camel bone, mixed with pitch and iron filings, can pass superficial tests, and the most expensive jars, those purported to contain parchment-trapped royal remains, are almost never opened by buyers for fear of scandal. Buying is an act of faith. The legal and religious worlds also take note. A church official writes to a cardinal describing the trade with moral urgency. The bodies of the dead are not commodities, he scribbles, and the poor are plundered to feed this appetite. Local magistrates occasionally issue edicts against grave robbing. Some cities pass laws making it punishable to dig up graves for sale, yet enforcement is lax. The demand, after all, lines the pockets of influential patrons. Kings, noblemen, and wealthy merchants prefer the remedy to the rule. You sit in a lecture hall one afternoon and listen as a visiting professor of medicine rails against the practice. He speaks calmly, but his words are sharp. We are physicians, not grave robbers, he tells the assembled students. To cure the living by consuming the dead is an affront to reason and to God. He points to cases where contaminated material caused septic wounds. He speaks of the political danger. The poor will be hunted for their bodies, families will be left bereft, and social trust will erode. Yet conversely, there are moments when human-derived remedies meet real physiological demand. Think of chronic bleeding, of sores that refuse to knit, of fevers that drain a body into waste conditions, for which options are limited. A topical salve, perhaps carrying astringent compounds from burned bone or the fats of embalmed tissue, might indeed affect local inflammation or act as a barrier. Folk remedies often contain active components, even if the theory behind them is wrong. In the absence of better options, people grasp at any hope. At the same time, the spectacle of it all attracts charlatans. You watch a man at the fair who sets up a small stage and sings the virtues of a royal Mamiya paste that will restore vigor, memory, and even deliver prophetic dreams. Crowds gather, coins spill, the seller winks. He will later be arrested for fraud, but the money is gone. Conmen exploit faith, and faith breeds more buyers. And then there are the darker rumors. You hear of midnights when coffins are opened, when the poor are robbed of their dead, and a clandestine industry processes the bodies with caustic materials. You hear that some patrons prefer certain attributes in their materia: the vigor of the condemned, the youth of the beggar, the purity of the unwed. Markets adapt. When demand rises for a specific quality, suppliers seek it by any means. The political consequences are not abstract. A scandal erupts when a noble family accuses an apothecary of selling them counterfeit material that poisoned their son. There are trials. Witnesses testify about jars and ledgers, about a hooded man at a key, about the cadaverous smell that clung to the kitchen where the paste was made. The apothecary swears ignorance, but the city reels. For a time, trust collapses. The guild is pressured to adopt stricter rules. The magistrate demands seals on imported goods. The church issues yet another denunciation. The market falters. It is in that moment of crisis that the first serious scientific pushback occurs. A young physician publishes a treatise arguing for a different approach. He draws on experimental observation, detailed dissections, and the nascent spirit of inquiry that will bloom into the Enlightenment. He does not merely condemn the grotesque. He offers alternatives: distilled plant extracts, mineral compounds, early pharmacopoeias that attempt to standardize dosing and content. His work is not immediately decisive, but it opens a door. Change is slow. The trade continues, reduced but not extinguished. Some practitioners cling to the old ways as a matter of tradition and profit. Others adapt, replacing suspect ingredients with botanical or mineral substitutes, rebranding their wares as safer alternatives. Over the next decades, as chemistry advances and as public health measures slowly improve urban sanitation, the rationale for human-derived powders weakens. The Enlightenment will not deliver immediate justice for the dead, but it will delegitimize the trade in many places. Yet the memory of the practice lingers. It leaves marks both in the ledger of commerce and in the conscience of a culture. Families still whisper about missing graves. Old apothecaries keep jars in attics, and sometimes, in the oddest places, the old recipes resurface among the desperate or the curious. You close the ledger in your hands and feel the weight of the commerce and the ethics. This is not merely a story of primitive medicine. It is a story of human need, of commerce, of belief, and of the brittle boundary between what is acceptable and what is not. The jars remain, however, and the market, in its darker corners, keeps turning. You settle into the dry, paper-smelling air of the university library, turning the brittle pages of pamphlets that smell faintly of pitch and dust. The debate over human-derived remedies is loud and public now. Physicians publish pamphlets, students argue in lecture halls, and printers spool out tracts that will be read in taverns and salons alike. At the heart of the argument are the recipes themselves. They are practical, precise, and often grotesquely detailed. One common formula calls for the slow roasting of bone until it turns to blackened ash. That ash is sieved and mixed with powdered myrrh and a pinch of powdered saffron. The mixture is bound into an oil using rendered human fat if available. Fat from an elderly person is preferred because it is thought to be less volatile. This oil is painted on festering sores to draw out putrid humors, and in some reports, it does seem to reduce suppuration simply by creating a protective, oily seal that keeps pus from spreading. Another recipe, recorded in a small Italian compendium, blends powdered sculcovarium, reduced to a fine dust, with wine, honey, and crushed rosemary. The author recommends a spoonful in the evening to warm the brain and ease melancholia. A Venetian nobleman swore by this mixture and funded the printing of the compendium to spread the cure. Money, as always, helps confidence spread. Yet other formulas are darker. An English surgeon writes of a plaster made from boiled human placenta and the rendered fat of a condemned man, used for women with postpartum bleeding. The rationale, he explains, is sympathetic. What has once been life-giving retains medicinal virtue. Elsewhere, a recipe for an analeptic electuary requires dried heart powdered with aromatic roots and rolled into pills with sugar. A patient with recurrent syncope swallowed these pills and reportedly did not faint for many months. Such anecdotes travel quickly, and witnesses proliferate. Opponents strike back, not only with moral arguments, but with early empirical skepticism. A group of Parisian physicians begin publishing records of failed treatments, carefully noting the lack of reproducibility. They dissected supposed mummy samples and found, in many cases, simple charred animal remains or compressed plant resins dyed to look human. In a public demonstration, a skeptical apothecary dissolved a black lump in vinegar and performed a chemical test that contemporary eyes looked crude but persuasive. The residue contained more pitch and iron filings than human bone. The crowd that day cheered the exposure. The controversy is not merely academic. It moves into courts and monasteries. A high-profile trial pins an apothecary to the rack. He confesses under pressure to selling false materials and is fined. A bishop delivers a sermon condemning the desecration of graves as an offense against both divine law and social order. Convents, meanwhile, complain of thefts. Poor families report that their children's graves have been disturbed and bones stolen. The manuscripts you read brim with righteous fury and with fear. Meanwhile, there are those who try to legitimize the practice with method and system. A small circle of learned men attempts to standardize what they call mumia pharmaceutica. They catalog sources with more care, demanding provenance, like merchants demand origin papers. They recommend processing protocols, slow desiccation rather than crude boiling, storage in sealed glass with labels noting the donor, the date of acquisition, and the purported origin. These physicians argue that with proper standards, risks fall and beneficial properties might be preserved. Their journals report fewer adverse reactions once quality control is in place. At the same time, monasteries play a fascinating role. Some orders inherit old jars from earlier centuries, fragments of local saints or ancestors preserved by pious families. Monks keep meticulous records of doses and patients, and sometimes they report miraculous results. Pilgrims come, seeking small, powdered relics in hopes of healing. This blurred line between relic, remedy, and reliquary gives the mummy trade a veneer of sanctity that complicates moral outrage. If a relic can be a conduit of grace, some argue, why cannot a substance derived from the human body be medicine? But not all such attempts at professionalization succeed. The Enlightenment rolls in with new tools and new temperaments. Chemistry begins to provide explanations that humoral theory cannot sustain. Experimentalists isolate plant alkaloids and mineral salts. They demonstrate that many wondrous effects previously ascribed to human powders actually derive from botanical astringents or from antiseptic properties of certain resins. Medical schools begin to teach standardized dosing and reject anecdote as authority. The decline is gradual rather than abrupt. Legislation tightens around grave robbing, and guilds punish practitioners who traffic in dubious materia. New guides and compilations promote botanical pharmacopoeias and diminish the space for human-derived materia. Yet, cultural memory is stubborn. In remote regions, in pockets of superstition, and among those who can afford private rituals, human-derived remedies linger. You read a final account before you close the ledger. It concerns a small town where a midwife uses a shred of a saint's venerated shroud to staunch a woman's bleeding. The woman recovers and attributes the cure to the relic. The townsfolk continue the practice for generations. Only later, a visiting physician identifies the shroud fragment as ordinary linen stained with plant tannins. The remedy worked not because of sanctity, but because the linen contained natural astringents. Yet the story endures. Faith, ritual, and medicine braided again. So what is the verdict? The history you are reading does not give a simple moral or a tidy conclusion. It shows a complex weave of human need and ingenuity, of commerce and credulity, of scientific method and superstition. The horror is real. The cures sometimes worked. The trade in human-derived materia was at once a symptom of desperation and an engine of profit, and its legacy is ambiguous, a cautionary tale about ethics in medicine, and also a reminder that therapies do not arise in a vacuum. They form within a culture that prizes certain metaphors and fears others. You close the brittle pamphlet, the ink flakes. Outside, a bell tolls. Somewhere in the city, an apothecary will mix another potion tonight. Some will be harmless, made from herb and oil. Some will be more sinister. And in the ledger, your name is recorded as apprentice who will carry knowledge forward for good or ill. You are now ready to meet the most notorious cases, those that haunted courtrooms, pulpits, and pamphlets across Europe. These stories spread not only because they were sensational, but because they forced society to ask questions about life, death, commerce, and morality. First, there is the case of the Duke of Mantua. In 1576, the Duke fell into a wasting fever that would not abate. His physicians tried bloodletting herbs and balms. Nothing worked. A confidant whispered to the Duke of an apothecary who claimed a remedy made from ancient royal remains. The Duke consented. The remedy was administered. Days later, his fever broke. He lived. The apothecary received lands and protection, but whispers followed. Rivals alleged the apothecary bought cadavers from the executed and sold them as relics. A pamphlet war began. Handbills accused the apothecary of corpse theft. Supporters called him a savior. Courts were uncertain which side to believe. In the end, political interests prevailed, and the apothecary kept his privileges. The verdict on his conscience, if there was one, remained unread. Then there is the darker tale out of Seville, where a consortium of physicians and a tradesman were tried for murder. A poor man had disappeared. Gold had been found in that man's cottage, and witnesses claimed to have seen the tradesman carrying a wrapped bundle at night. The bundle was never recovered, but suspicion sufficed. The tradesman argued he had purchased exotic materia from foreign merchants, and that any bodies found had been lawfully acquired. The court deliberated for months. The bishop called for moral clarity. The dead are not goods. Yet jurors aghast at allegations nonetheless feared to upset the powerful. The verdict was mixed: a fine and temporary exile, a sentence lighter than many expected. The scandal, however, reverberated for decades, and families kept watch over their graves with new vigilance. Not all legal responses were ineffective. In London, reformers pushed through strict anti-grave robbing statutes by the early 18th century. Public outcry, occasional riots, and the steady work of investigative physicians made body snatching a risky proposition. Physicians began to rely more on anatomical donations conducted with consent, and medical schools instituted charters to protect donors and to legitimize dissection. The ugly market did not vanish overnight, but by making the trade riskier and by creating legal channels for anatomical study, lawmakers reduced the power of the mummy trade. Religious authorities also weighed in with force. The Vatican issued rebukes, and local bishops published pastoral letters, telling the faithful that desecrating graves for profit or curiosity was a grave sin. Many sermons used the mummy trade as an exemplar of moral degradation, the living exploiting the dead for profit. Preachers urged compassion and care for the poor in death. Yet religion also complicated matters. Relics and remains of saints continued to hold deep devotional status. When an apothecary claimed his materia came from a venerable source, the line between sacrament and ingredient blurred. Among scholars, the debate hardened into a proto-ethical discourse. A physician at the University of Padua published a remarkable essay arguing that medical practice required both empirical rigor and moral restraint. He proposed that doctors should refuse any material that could not be obtained ethically and insisted on transparency about sources. This essay circulated widely and influenced several medical guilds. It was an early argument for what you might call clinical ethics. Still, human-derived remedies persisted in popular practice. Folk healers and midwives, who often operated outside guild scrutiny, continued to use relics, shrouds, and powdered remains in isolated communities. Those who lacked access to trained physicians had fewer options, and the cultural belief in sympathetic cures did not vanish with new science. In many rural parishes, old cures were remembered and relied upon for generations. Now consider the case studies that scholars retell with particular attention. A Venetian merchant who survived a fever after taking a mummy tonic credited his life to the remedy, but later developed chronic digestive problems that bled intermittently. A French woman who received a placenta plaster after childbirth did not bleed to death, but her child contracted an infection and died weeks later. These stories complicate the moral ledger. Outcomes were mixed. Correlation was not causation, and the lack of controlled trials meant that attribution was always uncertain. Fast forward to the 19th century, as chemistry and pathology matured, human-derived materia receded from formal medicine. Scientists isolated active plant compounds and discovered antiseptics that worked more reliably than oily salves. Pasteur, Lister, and others transformed the understanding of infection and wound care. As hospitals improved sanitation, the practical need for desperate remedies diminished. Yet the cultural echoes persisted. Literary works, plays, and pamphlets kept the image of the mummy apothecary alive. Gothic fiction borrowed the visceral details of powdered remains and graveyard thefts to terrify readers. The sensation of the age fed art and lore, the same cultural anxieties about death, identity, and the commodification of the body found new expression in fiction. In the 20th century, scholars began to untangle the facts from the myths. Archaeologists traced trade routes and uncovered evidence that mummified human remains had indeed been exported to Europe. Chemical analysis of old jars revealed human protein residues in some cases and plant resins in others. Historians catalogued legal records that showed a patchwork of enforcement and regulation. Ethicists began to point to the mummy trade as an instructive episode in the history of medical ethics, a case study in what happens when demand, commerce, and limited knowledge collide. Today, when we look back, there are useful lessons. The mummy trade shows how medical practice is embedded in social conditions. Poverty, war, plague, and inequality push people toward risky remedies. It shows how commercial incentives can warp ethical choices. It reveals how belief systems, religious, philosophical, or cultural, shape what counts as a cure. And it reminds us that modern medicine enjoys ethical frameworks, legal protections, and scientific tools that were once absent. You close the last of the trial transcripts and feel the weight of these histories. There is no neat moral coda. The story of the Cannibal Spice is a mirror. It asks what we will do when desperate choices confront us. It asks how we will balance hope and caution, profit and charity, curiosity and respect for the dead. Outside, bells toll. Students brush past the library doors. An apothecary across the square lights a lamp and begins preparing herbs for the night. Somewhere, a ledger lies waiting with a blank line, ready to be filled by someone whose choices will join the long ledger of history. Now we move from story to scrutiny. Centuries after the jars were emptied and the ledgers closed, modern science did what earlier physicians could not. It looked under the varnish and asked, with instruments rather than handshakes, what these powders actually contained. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, archaeologists and chemists re-examined old apothecary jars, museum samples, and archival receipts. Protein sequencing, stable isotope analysis. What those methods revealed was complicated and sometimes unsettling. Some jars indeed contained human proteins. Tiny peptides, fragments of collagen, and traces of keratin were detected in samples taken from the residues of antique containers. That meant that, in at least a subset of cases, the European market did receive human-derived materia. Meanwhile, other samples turned out to be plant resins, bitumen, or animal bone char. In short, the market was mixed, and so was the truth. The discovery forced a new kind of history. It was not merely a tale of superstition and greed. It was a record of real bodies transformed into commodities, sometimes intentionally and sometimes inadvertently. Scientific proof reanimated a moral debate. Scholars began to ask new questions. Who owned those bodies? Who profited? How did inequality shape supply and demand? Forensic techniques also allowed historians to trace geographic origin with surprising accuracy. Isotope analysis, the study of ratios of certain elements like strontium, oxygen, and carbon within biological materials, can indicate where an individual grew up and what kind of diet they had. In a few high-profile studies, residues that had been labeled as exotic Egyptian mummy turned out to have isotope signatures inconsistent with North African origin. Conversely, some jars matched the expected signature of embalmed Egyptian tissue. The message was clear. The trade included both authentic imports and sophisticated forgeries. Meanwhile, conservation scientists studying pigments discovered another echo of the cannibal spice in the art world. From the 17th through the 19th centuries, a pigment known as mummy brown was widely used by European painters. It was literally derived from desiccated human remains, or, more often, from animal sources, and bitumen mixed to produce a warm brown hue. The pigment faded into disfavor as ethical and practical concerns rose. Yet its history demonstrates how deeply human-derived materials were embedded in cultural production. Modern museum ethics grapple with these inheritances. Museums and universities around the world possess collections that include human remains, or artifacts made from human tissues. Curators and ethicists now operate within frameworks that prioritize consent, cultural sensitivity, and the rights of descendant communities. Similar ethical norms are emerging in Europe as public awareness grows. The idea that human material should be displayed, traded, or used with impunity no longer holds sway in many institutions. At the same time, historians caution against simplistic narratives of progress. The fact that museums now adopt better protocols does not erase centuries of exploitation. It does not undo the theft of pauper graves, nor the commerce that turned bodies into medicine. Rather, it offers a context for responsibility. Modern scholars insist on a multi-layered approach, acknowledge the past honestly, give voice to descendants, and use historical knowledge to guide ethical practice. There are also lessons for contemporary medicine. The history of mummy powder reminds us that desperate circumstances can push practitioners toward untested therapies. When standard care fails, people will seek anything that promises relief. That impulse is human and enduring. Modern regulatory frameworks, evidence-based medicine, and institutional review boards exist to protect patients and to prevent exploitation. Yet resource gaps, emergencies, and inequality still create environments where unethical experimentation can occur. The story of the cannibal spice is a warning. Oversight matters, and so does social justice. Cultural memory is stubborn. The images of powdered remains, of coffins opened at night, and of apothecaries trading in secrecy have lodged in art and literature. Gothic writers exploited the visceral detail. Romantic painters invoked the exotic. More recent fiction and film borrowed these elements as shorthand for moral transgression and human hubris. These cultural artifacts shape how contemporary audiences perceive the past. They also shape how historians frame their questions. Finally, the trade leaves a moral residue that continues to prompt debate. Should museums retain jars with evidence of human residue? Should they display them with contextual interpretation or lock them away? If a jar contains material that likely came from a named individual, does provenance require attempts at identification and repatriation? These are not rhetorical questions. they are practical dilemmas faced by curators and researchers today. In some places, the answers have been clear. Institutions have worked with communities to repatriate remains and to remove insensitive displays. They have issued apologies and created new policies. In other cases, the matter is unresolved, complicated by mixed provenance, legal ambiguity, or the absence of living descendants. The nuance matters. You close the modern report and see threads connect. Early chemists who coldly exposed fraud, a guild system that sometimes reformed itself, a public that moved from credulity to scrutiny. Progress occurred unevenly, but it did occur. The jars that once sold for coin now serve as evidence in a different kind of economy, the economy of knowledge and ethics. As you prepare to leave the archive, you reflect on the human shape of the story. The Cannibal Spice was not a single mistake or a single outrage. It was a complex phenomenon shaped by plague, poverty, power, and belief. Science, when allowed to speak, clarified facts that had been clouded by myth. Ethics, when applied, challenged practices that had seemed normal. But history warns us that in moments of crisis, the same pressures return. That is the uneasy legacy you carry with you as you step into the bright air. You have walked through market stalls and courtrooms, opened jars that once smelled of resin and blood, and read ledgers that recorded names and prices. You have seen how a practice grows from desperation, how commerce amplifies it, and how ideas about the body shape what people will accept as medicine. So what now? What should we take away from this strange chapter of history? First, recognize the human logic that underpinned those practices. People were not simply cruel or ignorant. They lived in a world without antibiotics, without germ theory, and with mortality at their doorstep. If a powdered relic seemed to stop a fever, then it was not irrational to try it again. The moral blind spots are easier to see in hindsight. At the time, the decisions were entangled with grief, fear, and the hope that anything might help. Second, consider the role of markets and power. When the wealthy can pay, demand changes supply. When kings and noblemen prefer exotic remedies, entire trades emerge. The mummy trade thrived because patrons were willing to pay for perceived prestige and for anything that offered hope. Markets do not invent morals, they reveal them. And when profit enters the equation, ethics can be bowled aside. Third, note how religion and ritual complicated the picture. The same society that condemned grave robbing also venerated relics. In that culture, a dried bone could be both saint and medicine. That dual status blurred lines between sacred and secular uses of human remains. It also made regulation harder. Who could definitively say whether a substance was illicit or sacramental? The answer varies with power and perspective. Fourth, watch how science and regulation gradually changed practice. The rise of more rigorous chemical methods, standardization, and legal protections did not erase the need that gave rise to mummy powders, but they transformed how society approached remedy. Better knowledge, clearer ethics, and institutional oversight shifted the terrain. That is progress, imperfect and slow, but real. There is also a final lesson about stories themselves. How we tell these tales matters. If historians only tell a horror story, then the past becomes a pile of monsters. If they only sanitize the past, then they erase the human grief that led to desperate measures. The best history sits in between. It explains the incentives and constraints while refusing to excuse exploitation. Now imagine a modern parallel. Medicine today confronts its own ethical quagmires. Think of experimental therapies offered to dying patients outside of formal trials. Think of wealthy medical tourism, where the ability to pay buys a shot at unproven treatment. Think of data mining of vulnerable populations, where consent is blurred. The instruments have changed, but the human vulnerabilities that created demand for the Cannibal Spice remain similar. So what do we do with this knowledge? First, we do not hide it. We talk about it honestly. Museums that hold jars and documents display them with full context and with the voices of the marginalized included. Scholars publish findings with humility about what they cannot prove. Journalists avoid sensationalism and seek to explain how and why people made the decisions they did. Second, we keep strengthening ethical standards. Medicine today has institutional review boards, informed consent procedures, and strict rules about human remains. Those tools exist because the past taught painful lessons. The job is not finished. Ethical protections must be global, not only for those who can hire lawyers. Equity matters. When wealth dictates the range of medical options, injustice follows. Third, we cultivate memory in ways that are respectful and useful. That means repatriation when appropriate. It means acknowledging that gaps in the historical record often reflect the silence of the poor and of women. It means making space for descendants and communities to share how they want the past remembered. Finally, keep your curiosity alive, but your skepticism sharper. Wonder at the strange remedies of the past. Read the old recipes with a scientist's eye and a historian's caution. Ask how many cures were merely cures in the story of the person who lived, and how many were artifacts of the world that made that person reach for an impossible answer. You close the last ledger, but the question lingers in the air like a scent you cannot quite place. Who benefits? Who is harmed? How do we value a human life when science cannot yet fix what ails it? The answers are never tidy. Before you leave, there is one last item in the archive. A small, folded note in a 17th century hand. It reads simply, "Remember the bones." It is like a warning, not only about theft, about remembering responsibility. You walk into the bright street. The city is not the same place you entered. You are older, not only in years, but in perspective. You see the apothecary across the square, the same shopkeepers, different wares. You think of the jars that once held human dust and how those jars would be treated differently today. And you understand this. History is not merely a catalogue of the grotesque, it is a mirror. It shows us that under stress, people can reach for anything that offers hope. It shows us how commerce can distort compassion into commodity. It shows us how power, belief, and need tangle until it is hard to tell who wears the robe of the healer and who wears the mask of the merchant. As you prepare to turn off the lamp in the archive, remember that the past has one last favor to ask. Do not let desperation erase dignity. Whether it is a powdered relic in a jar or an unproven therapy in a brochure, insist on ethics, demand transparency, and care for the most vulnerable. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a strange and troubling corner of medical history, consider subscribing to Mindtrip FM for more episodes that blend research, storytelling, and unsettling truth. Leave a comment with the case that shocked you the most, and tell us which historical mystery you want to explore next. When you are ready, close the book. Did you know that the smallest things can hold the largest questions. A powdered shard, a resinous lump, a sealed jar on a shelf. These are not just curiosities. They are fingerprints of how a society cares for the living and remembers the dead. We have walked a long road together. Market stalls where black lumps changed hands. Courtrooms where reputations were made and broken. Lecture halls where early skeptics lit the first fires of scientific reform. And dusty archives where modern chemistry finally told us what those powders were. Along the way, we met apothecaries who believed they were helping, merchants who followed demand, desperate families who grasped at hope, and reformers who tried to build a better path. What does this story ask of us today? It asks for honesty. It asks us to look at the layers of cause and effect. It asks us to separate horror from context and to refuse easy judgments. The people who bought those powders were not monsters in a horror tale. They were mothers, fathers, rulers, and physicians making choices in the dark. The traffickers were greedy, yes, but they were also operating inside economies that rewarded risk. The reformers were right to insist on ethics, but they were not always in a position to feed the hungry or stop a plague. There is one clear imperative. Ethics cannot be merely aspirational. They must be practical and enforceable. When medicine is governed by profit and fear, vulnerable people pay the highest price. Modern systems of oversight, institutional review boards, and consent protocols exist to prevent the abuses that once seemed normal. Those systems are imperfect, but they are better than the alternatives. The story of the Cannibal Spice is a demonstration of why these protections matter. There is another lesson about narrative. We must not let sensational stories drown out the structural causes. When histories focus only on the grotesque, they risk simplifying and moralizing a complex reality. The poor sold their dead because they were poor. Grave robbers dug because their economy offered few alternatives. Patrons insisted on exotic cures because status and fear pushed them. If we want to prevent future abuse, we must deal with poverty, inequity, and crisis response, not merely punish individual villains. Then there is memory. How do we remember what was wrong and yet learn from it? The answer is not erasure, and it is not fetishization. Museums and archives should be transparent. They should provide context, consultation, and collaboration with communities who are descendants or stakeholders. Orthodoxy and shame will not solve these problems. Dialogue will. Repatriation is appropriate. Repatriate. Where educational value exists, present it honestly and sensitively. Finally, the story is a mirror for modern dilemmas. Think of modern unregulated therapies, unproven cures advertised on the internet, or medical tourism where wealthy patients chase experimental procedures in jurisdictions with weak oversight. The tools have changed, but the dynamics are familiar. Desperation meets commerce, and the powerless are at risk. The past can be a teacher if we are willing to learn. As you close this episode in your mind, consider an image that will stay with you. A small jar on a low shelf, long forgotten, its paper label faded. On a good day, a jar is an object of knowledge. On a bad day, a jar is a monument to what happens when ethics lag behind need. In either case, the jar asks us a question: who stands between the vulnerable and those who would take advantage of them? Institutions, laws, communities, ethics. You do. If you are a viewer, your attention matters. Call out misinformation. Support ethical science. Vote for public policies that increase access to proven treatments. Remember that curiosity without care can be cruel. If you are a caregiver or a student of history, carry the nuance forward. Do not summarize this story into horror alone. Use it as a starting point for conversations about policy, about compassion, and about how societies respond to crisis. We have told a story that is uncomfortable, sometimes revolting, and always human. That is the point. History is not a museum of monsters. It is a classroom for how to become better. Before we finish, one more thing. The jars and the ledgers are not only historical artifacts. They are proof that people respond to limits with ingenuity and sometimes error. They are proof that laws, institutions, and ethics were forged out of real problems, and that those tools can be reforged again when new dilemmas arise. So take this story as a challenge. Let it sharpen your sense of right and wrong. Let it deepen your compassion for people who made desperate choices under unbearable pressures. Let it remind you that the good life for one person should not be built on the suffering of another. If this episode left you unsettled, then it has done its job. History is meant to unsettle, to complicate, and to illuminate. If you learned something new, share it, talk about it. The more we bring these conversations into the light, the less likely we are to repeat the darker chapters. Thank you for listening to this exploration of a grim and fascinating corner of medical history. If you want more episodes like this, where research meets storytelling, consider subscribing to Mindtrip FM and sharing this video with someone who loves unsettling history. Leave a comment with the question you would ask an apothecary of the past, and we will read the best ones in the next episode. Close the ledger, put the jar back on its shelf, step into the sunlight with the weight of the story in your pocket and a commitment to do better.